Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the January 27, 2009 meeting of the Glendale Housing Authority. May we have a roll call for the Housing Authority, please?
Authority members: Draymond.
Here.
Mincy.
Here.
Najarian.
Here.
Farazian.
Here.
Quintero.
Here.
Weaver.
Here.
Chairman Yusefian.
Here. May we have your report, please?
The agenda for the January 27, 2009 regular meeting of the Glendale Housing Authority was posted on Thursday, January 22, 2009 on the bulletin board outside City Hall.
Thank you. Is there a motion for the minutes?
So moved.
Second.
Okay. I will abstain on the minutes of the December 16th, and with that abstention, the minutes will be approved as submitted. What's next, please?
Next is oral communication. Discussion is limited to items not part of this agenda. Each speaker is allowed 5 minutes. Members of the Housing Authority may question or respond to a speaker, but there will be no debate or decision, and the matter may be referred to staff through the Executive Director for investigation and a report.
Thank you. With that, I'll have one card. Herbert Milano. Mr. Milano, you're up.
Thank you, Chairman Yusefian, members of the Housing Authority and city staff. My name is Herbert Milano. I come before you to again give my preoccupation with the fact that it seems to me, it's not a fact, it just appears to me that the quality of life indicators, as I envision them, will probably not come before you. As you remember, in June, when you originally requested from staff the process, the original objective was to have something done before the end of the year. That's December. At that time, I volunteered to help you or help the staff serve as a project manager for this, so that at least I could periodically report to you on any progress to this. But since it was not accepted, I figured I'll still provide you with some kind of update. And from very early on, I felt that there was probably not the likelihood that this project would not slip. You know, I cannot go over budget because you haven't assigned any additional resources or cost to it. I figure that a document such as this is incredibly important, because at the end of the day, all of the activities of the City Council and all the objectives of the Housing Authority need to be presented at some type of outcomes somewhere in some kind of document. And the quality of life indicators is the overall, I mean, the quality of life is the final end-all of all of the things that you do here in this chamber. Several years ago, I participated in as a board member of a program run by the UCLA Vice President's Office, which was called the Academic Centers of Excellence, of which Mr. Frank Quintero was also a member. And the objective of that program was to assist and create a culture of going to college for disadvantaged children. One of the first things that I saw about that particular program was that there was a lack of financial consistency with regard to supporting the administrative staff. When I then took the book of the Youth Alliance, or some book with regard to all the youth programs, and I placed several calls, 2 years after the book was published, I could not find a single individual who had been there with the organization from 2 years earlier. In other words, they could not keep proper administrative support. And it was my contention then that without adequate funding so that they have sustainability of their administration, it will be very unlikely that these organizations could bring the type of volunteers and the type of, or sustain the type of programs, or they themselves to ask for additional funds from other sources on a consistent basis. And that's why I decided to sort of look to see what the city could do with regard to providing the type of sustainability, not just from HUD, but from the city's general fund. The answer has always been that there is no funds available, that the city is short of money, or that there are constraints. And so I decided to take a look at the payroll, since it's been one of my missions for the last couple of years. And I'm looking at the city of Glendale's class control records by class and title sequence. Basically, all the titles of all of the positions are here. And I managed to locate the deputy fire chief at $192,000 a year. That was back in July of last year. So if he is retiring at 90% of his salary, he will be getting $171,000 for the rest of his life. You know, it's not that people are retiring at the age of 65, like most people in private industry today, and sometimes they have to retire at the age of 70. He's retiring at the age of 51 with $171,000. And I said, oh my God, How in the world could you approve this? How on God's earth can someone not providing a service be getting $171,000 a year, and who knows what other things? You know, and you add all of these excesses, and there's no wonder why the problems that we have with youth and families at risk and the things that we could attend to, they're not fixed. I thought they were intractable. It's not intractable. The fact is that the money is being used and misdirected to many other individuals who have a good organization or a good union behind them, and are then able to extract all of this money from the city. I think it is fair and justified for this city to provide at least $1 million to sustain all of these nonprofits, the nonprofits that have been already previously approved, because these are hard times. And this is the time when we actually need to show up for those individuals. So that's my advocacy. My advocacy is the fact that excessive pay and benefits, and at the same time, our tax money that is primarily needed for the most in need is not available. Thank you.
Thank you. Madeline, isn't it true they're meeting this week or next week, I think?
Mr.
I
Chairman.
got a little email.
Yes, Mr. Chair, members of the Housing Authority. They have been meeting on a continual basis, and the timeline for completing the report is by the end of February. And according to Mr. Engel, they're still on line to meet that. It might slip a month or so, but it definitely will be within the next month or two.
Yeah. Mr. Engel is here, by the way. Okay. Oral communications closed. What's next, please?
Next is authority member or staff comments.
Comments? Hearing none. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
Thank you.
Thank you and welcome to the Glendale Redevelopment Agency meeting. It's January 27th, 2009. I'd like to call it to order. Let's take roll call, please.
Agency members Draymond.
Here.
Quintero.
Here.
Weaver.
Here.
Yusefian.
Here.
Chairman Najarian.
Here. Here we have your report.
Agenda for the January 27th, 2009 meeting of the Glendale Redevelopment Agency was posted on Thursday, January 22nd, 2009 on the bulletin board outside City Hall.
Thank you. The next item.
Next item is the approval of minutes.
Mr. Chair, I will abstain.
So moved on the minutes.
Second.
Second.
Okay, noting Mr. Yusefian's abstention. With no objections or corrections, the minutes are approved as submitted. Next item, please.
Next item is oral communication. Discussion is limited to items not part of this agenda. Each speaker is allowed 5 minutes. Members of the redevelopment agency may question or respond to a speaker, but there will be no debate or decision, and the matter may be referred to staff through the executive director for an investigation and report.
I have one card from Herbert Milano.
Chairman Najarian, members of the redevelopment agency and city staff. I'm doing a follow-up on a brief presentation that I made last week, inquiring with regard to what the city is doing to provide some type of additional support for the sustainability of businesses that are in the redevelopment agency and the area and that are along brand. Many decades ago, I used to have a business. It was a merchant business that I held for several years before I sold it. And I know the type of sacrifices in terms of investment and time, and the sacrifice that families make in order for these businesses to remain viable and to remain vibrant. And so whenever I visit these businesses, I recognize their situation and the type of sacrifices that these families are making. And so I made a suggestion, the same suggestion that I had made a couple of years ago when brand was being resurfaced, that we encourage the city employees to shop in Glendale. And I was told by the chairman last week that you are advertising and promoting that idea on Channel 6. Several years ago, there was a study made concerning the viewership of Channel 6. I don't know if any of you have had the opportunity to look at that document, but it was a statistical survey of the viewership. One of the things that struck me is that on any typical month, only about 20%, 1 out of 5 residents who have cable tend to watch Channel 6. So in other words, in order for someone to get to view something that occurs during an oral communication session, or this session, for instance, it has to be repeated at least 4 times to get an assurance that a sufficient number of people who have cable will read it. From what I know of the people in, like my tenants, for example, they have satellite television. Many of them are not getting cable Channel 6, so they are out of the loop. I remember when I was running for city council, and I went to the Royal Canyon Homeowners Association. There were many people who actually had never watched and been here for decades and never received the news press or the LA Times. So there's a significant segment of the population that is totally unaware of what is really taking place in these chambers. And so in the same line, if we are going to promote this idea that employees who have the permanent and secure jobs, that they shop in Glendale, I wonder if that venue is an adequate venue. And if we do not have objectives, how are we going to achieve it? Because I think that as all of the taxpayers are now more unsure about their financial situation, the least thing that we can ask for is that those individuals who draw their income partially out of the taxes being collected on all these shops, that they support it. I don't think it's an unjust request. And I think it bears for us to know that these individuals who have put so much of their financial health and future here in the city, that they should be supported in some special way. It is the redevelopment agency that has hired, I believe, an economic development manager. It would be nice for us to know what objectives have been created in order to really add to the sustainability of this business that are now in a very fragile state. And to see if there are any outcomes that we can measure, to see if year to year we're actually showing results. I would like to know that. Thank you.
I have no other cards. Oral communications is closed. The next item, please.
Next item is agency member or staff comments.
Any comments? No comments. Next item.
Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
We are adjourned.
Okay. Well, good afternoon. I know you're out there. I can see you. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Tuesday, January 27th, 2009 joint meeting of the Glendale City Council and the Glendale Housing Authority. Mr. City Clerk, could we call the roll for council, please?
Council members Najarian.
Here.
Quintero.
Here.
Weaver.
Here.
Yusefian.
Here.
Mayor Draymond.
Here.
You have a roll call for the Housing Authority, please.
Authority members Draymond.
Here.
Mincy.
Here.
Najarian.
Here.
Barazian.
Here.
Quintero.
Here.
Weaver.
Here.
Chairman Yusefian.
Here.
Mr. Kasakian, could you share your report with us?
Agenda for the January 27th, 2009 joint public meeting of the Glendale City Council and the Glendale Housing Authority was posted on Thursday, January 2nd, 2009 on the bulletin board outside of City Hall.
Thank you. And our first item?
It's a public hearing, Director of Planning and Community Development and Housing regarding City of Glendale housing element of the general plan. At 1A is a council resolution certifying and adopting a certain negative declaration has been prepared pursuant to the California Environmental Quality Act. And at B is a council resolution amending the housing element of the general plan.
Thank you very much. Let's go to our Director of Planning, Hassan Hagani.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, Mr. Chair, members of the City Council and the Housing Authority. This has been a project that we've been, as you know, working on for a while, and this has been a joint project between the Planning Department and the Department of Community Development and Housing. We thank the staff from both departments and the members of the community and organizations that have worked with us as a task force throughout this time. The first draft of the housing element was presented to you last February. In fact, Glendale was one of the first cities in the state that prepared its draft, meeting the deadlines set forth by the state. However, since February's release of the draft, staff has been receiving comments from community organizations and the state Housing and Community Development Department, and staff has been working with the department to close the gap and address those concerns. So today, Laura Stotler, our principal planner in charge of the team preparing the housing element, is going to only highlight the changes that have occurred since the time that you actually heard the entire presentation on the housing element. And if you'd like to ask questions on the text of the housing element, she'll be able to answer those questions as well.
I think I should also, as a housekeeping measure, open the public hearing. How's that? Okay. Very good. All right, Ms. Stadler. Thank you, Mr. Hagani.
Thanks, Mayor Draymond, Council and Housing Authority members. What we're looking at is the revised draft housing element. It's from 2006 and 2014. The previous housing element that it's the current one that we have in effect, was adopted in 2000. That's the 1998 to 2005 housing element. So what we're looking at today is replacing that previous housing element. And as you're aware, the housing element is a required element of state law. It is required to be updated every 5 years. However, there's been a variety of bills based on funding. Sometimes that gets extended. That's why right now we're looking at an 8-year housing element. And a housing element is the primary document that the city uses for identifying the city's housing policy. Again, it is required by the state. And we not only have to adopt an element, but we also have to submit it to the state for certification. And having a certified housing element allows the city to qualify for a variety of additional funding opportunities that otherwise might not be available to us. So that is the reason why we are seeking to have a certified housing element. The housing element, as Hassan stated, we've been working on it for well over a year. We've had a variety of public input. We've had a housing task force that's met 4 or 5 times. We have a planning commission that has reviewed the document twice. And we've also had this before you last February for your review. Every time that we had a draft document done that had gone through public review, had been looked at by the Housing Task Force, we submitted it to the State Housing Community Development Department for their preliminary review. First time we submitted it was in February. We got a comment letter back in May, and it was approximately 11 pages long. So there were a variety of items that we had to address comments from not only the State Department of Housing and Community Development, but also some of the commenters, we have some in the audience today, that had interest in that element. In last July, we felt we had addressed those comments. We brought those comments to the Housing Task Force. They reviewed it. We brought it to the Planning Commission in August, and they gave us a go-ahead. They said they agreed with it. 2 issues that were on in August I want to bring your attention to. They had to do with secondary units and also inclusionary housing. Those were comments that we received from the State Housing Community Development Department and also comments that we received from some other agencies related to housing. Their concerns were that the city has adopted in the past a prohibition of second units. And those letters from HCD and also other providers had encouraged the city to reconsider that policy and to adopt a second unit policy citywide. Those letters also included a request that the city look at having inclusionary housing policy citywide. Right now, inclusionary housing policy is in effect for units in the San Fernando Road redevelopment area. And again, the city looked at that and recommendations were made by the Planning Commission to not extend that citywide. And again, that also complies with direction that we've received from you in the past that inclusionary units be limited to San Fernando Road redevelopment area. So the draft you have before you makes no changes to those policy comments that were received. Now what we do have in your packet is a list of all the formal comments that were received on the element. You have comments that are received from May, not only from HCD, but also from Public Council and Shelter Partnerships. You also have comment letters that were received in August based on the July draft. And then you also have comment letters received from Shelter Partnerships and also Housing Community Development in November of last year. So based on all those comments, we have prepared the housing element and amendments to it, the revised draft. You have a summary of major accomplishments that we've outlined in the staff report. Those summary of major accomplishments are also outlined in the housing element on page 8. If you take a look at that, what those accomplishments are steps the city has taken in the last housing element. That would be the 1998 to 2005 element. Those are steps that we've taken to implement that. Next, we have summary of key findings in the housing element, and that outlines our goals for the next 8 years. That would be actually 2006 to 2014. You can find those on page 9. And we also have the 8-year plan, and the 8-year plan is in chapter 2, and that's on page 18 of the housing element. The 8-year plan is really the heart of where our future actions need to be, our programs for how we're going to implement the housing element. And if you'd like me to go over those, I'd be happy to go over what those are.
I think let's press on. First of all, I'm under the assumption my colleagues, as well as myself, have read the report. So not just here, but also the volume.
It is quite a volume. We have just go over quickly what some of the program strategies are. That we did get one comment letter. I do feel I need to raise this issue.
All right.
We did get a comment raised by HCD regarding the programs that we already implement, and so we've included that into the program for density bonus, and it basically restates all the actions that are done by our Housing Community Development Department. When we wrote up the original element, we neglected to leave a whole paragraph of what a whole department does. We did add that, and that was recognized by HCD, so I just want to point that out. And then we also added Appendix D. It has to do with small lot consolidation and ability to build affordable housing in a variety of housing types on consolidated lots. That is a new addition that was by HCD in their November letter, and we have addressed that. And then we also addressed single room occupancy definitions, transitional supporting housing definitions, and those are also included in the element, as well as modification of locations for emergency shelters. There was a concern that we allow them in industrial zones. However, if they're within 300 feet of a residential zone, we require a CUP. And the state law has indicated that, or the state HCD has indicated that they would like us to remove the 300 feet definition to comply with state law. And so we've agreed to do that, and that is included in one of the housing programs in the document. So therefore, we are now asking you to approve the resolution adopting the negative declaration, and also approve the resolution to adopt the revised draft housing element and forward it to HCD for certification. And we have also provided a letter to you. It's a one-page letter, but it's double-sided, and that came from HCD, and that indicates that they feel the revised draft housing unit housing element is in compliance with state law. And therefore, we feel confident that if you do adopt this element, it would be certified by the state.
Very good. Mr. Mincy.
Before you go, the staff did a wonderful job in preparing this, no matter if there are lots and lots of pages. And the one area that I particularly thought was good was the list of projects in construction or under development in low-income housing, and also the list of completed projects. And it's nice to have that all in one area. But I did appreciate that, because there's a lot of work went in there and lots of pictures of our completed projects. And I certainly will refer to that in the future. And I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mincy. Anything else, Ms. Stoutman?
That's it.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me see if my colleagues have anything to add, subtract, comment before we go to our speaker, and then I'll come back and we'll clean up again with the authority and the council. Mr. Weaver.
Housekeeping rule.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Howard, do we take these separately or concurrently? A and D?
We can take them together.
Because I thought the environmental had to go first.
Well, the environmental has to go with the community development, with the other item, and they have to go either together, or you can take the environmental first, but you can't take the substantive matter first and the environmental second.
Okay.
That's something you can't do.
Concurrent or before?
All right.
Sir.
Thank you.
Ms. Ryan?
I'd like Laura to come back up and just explain to the public. We all know what the term inclusionary means when you're referring to units that are being constructed. And that means that there's a special meaning to that. So if you tell us, tell the public by way of us what inclusionary housing means.
Inclusionary housing means that when you have a number of units being built, a certain percentage of them must be affordable to lower income households.
And that percentage is in the San Fernando zone. It's 20%?
It's, if I may, Mr. Chairman, it's only in San Fernando zone, you're correct, and SFMU, and it is 9% affordable to low and moderate income and 6% affordable to very low income.
Below 50. Okay, so it means providing low-income housing as you build market housing.
Yes.
Mr. City Manager.
Just a few points of clarification. Only within the San Fernando project area, the housing replaced can be in the project area, or it can be outside the project area. If outside, it has to be on the basis of 2 units for every 1 unit that you're obligated to provide, and it's 15% for non-assisted housing, as I recall, and 30% for assisted housing, meaning the redevelopment agency assists in the development.
It's 15% for assisted or non-assisted, and it's a different number if it's actually built by the housing authority or the redevelopment agency. I'm not sure what that number is.
All right. Let's go to our speaker, Mr. Milano, Herbert Milano.
Mayor Draymond, members of the City Council, City staff. In past years, I have actually read through the housing element and done some research on the land use element, and including going over the overall general plan. What has always struck me as incredibly surprising is that oftentimes when down the road a few years, when any of these particular elements are not really fulfilled, or the letter of the objectives are not fulfilled, I hear sometimes a request that we need to amend our general plan because the particular elements were not, or the objectives of those elements were not fulfilled. In other words, it's sort of like you change the final end objective because along the way you decided not to do what the plans stated you should do. It's kind of like making a plan to go to New York, and along the way you get sidetracked to go into Austin, Texas to see a relative, and you spend all your time there, you don't arrive in New York. He says, well, we'll change the general plan. It was not our intent to go to New York in the first place. And the reason why I mention that is that oftentimes when we see these mitigation concepts, or we see environmental impact reports that are supposed to align all of these objectives, we find that you simply state the fact that you're not in compliance and go along your merry way. And so I wonder how effectively we've communicated this particular housing element to the general public. If I were to go to, let's say, the Homeowners Coordinating Council and pick at random any of the presidents there represented and say, give me 2 minutes on what you know about the housing element, would they be able to tell me anything? And that's the other problem I have, is how do we communicate this incredibly important document that gives you the trajectory that you will take in the next 8 years or 6 years, and then not have the public truly immersed in this process. I, for one, understand a few things. I understand the importance of, of attending to affordable housing and low-income housing as part of the overall plans of the city. But do we really have a very clear objective as to how the population will increase year to year and how you allocate towards that objective? I think that there are so many things in this product that the public should be aware of, and that we should test it to see how well the public really knows what's in here. I know you're going to go ahead and perhaps approve it today, but I think this merits presentation in the evening session, with a good summary of the overall objectives. And it is my hope that year to year you come back and say, all right, this was our objective, this is how we're doing so far, and have a review of those objectives clearly stated and evaluated every year. So a little bit more public participation, a little bit more definitive objectives for you to meet, and a little bit better reporting. That's what I'd like to see.
Perfect timing, Mr. Milano, by the way. All right. Other discussion from the Housing Authority or the City Council? Mr. Yusefian.
I would like to have Laura come up and explain to us how this dovetails with the RTP, which is Regional Planning Board, and some of the numbers that is here that deals with the number of housing units we have to build by a certain time, and also breakdown of how many of those are affordable, how many of those are regular.
Well, we have a regional housing needs projection, which comes from SCAG, and what they're looking for is what the future growth is going to be during the time frame in which this housing element covers. So that's the growth document that is used. It's used throughout Southern California to identify what a future growth pattern is. Based on that, SCAG comes out with regional housing needs, and they assign those to the different jurisdictions in Southern California. We were given a target, so this is what our regional housing needs is. Glendale, we have to show that we have adequate zoning to allow those numbers of units at those levels of affordability to be built. And we do have...
And the particular bill that is requiring some of those?
Well, there's SB 375, which that is a new bill. It is tying the regional transportation plan to the housing element. Right now, it shows that as of 2012, we're going to have a housing element in RTP that mesh. They're still looking, SCAG right now is doing study sessions on how they're going to actually implement that bill, and we've been attending that. At this time, it looks like we're going to have a sustainability program, which is going to come down that all the Arroyo Verdugo sub-region is going to have to comply with. We don't know what the shape of that is going to be at this time, but we are going to participate in that. And again, staff has been monitoring that. We've been working with transportation and then also with the city manager's department to watch what's going on at SCAG and to find out how that will affect us. At this time, our regional housing needs are all based on the units that could be built under existing residential zoning. We have not included units that could be built as far as our regional housing needs as mixed use, either under the mixed use zones or under the commercial zones where additional residential units can also be allowed. Part of the reason we did that is because it's looking like a lot of the SCAG policies are going to be based on mixed use zoning. And we want to make sure that we can get credit for all the mixed use zoning that we've done in the past, because we have had extensive rezoning based on mobility, and making sure that we put mobility and zoning in the correct places to encourage affordable housing development and use of transit systems. So we are aware of what the state's doing. We've been watching it. But until we know exactly what the direction from SCAG is going to be, we don't quite know yet how we're going to address it.
And what's our numbers?
Right now, 3,131 units, and that would be between 2006 and 2014.
Okay, and how many of that is affordable?
Out of that, the percentage of new construction need shows that we would have a need for 384 extremely low income, 383 very low income, 491 low income, 534 moderate income, and 1,340 above moderate income units.
So the majority of that number is for low income, and the rest is just regular. It's almost a 50-50 split.
Yes.
A little bit here and there.
Roughly.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Yusefian. Mr. Najarian.
Laura, the 3131 number is our RENA. Was that a RENA number?
Yes.
Okay. And you say that there are currently sufficient sites in the city to meet that number?
Yes, there are.
Where?
We have actually Appendix A identifies the answer is located. The sites are located throughout the city, and if you look at Appendix A, Appendix B, and Appendix D, we have maps throughout the city. We have addresses listing the adequate site. They're independent identifiers. So we would have the assessor parcel numbers, we have the addresses, the existing units, possible units for addition, the square footage of land, and also what the existing land use is. And again, this has all been reviewed by Housing and Community Development Department at the state. They found us to be in compliance and that we've adequately demonstrated that we have capacity to accommodate the regional housing need.
And that's based on the assumption that the zoning and density remains the same?
Yes.
Does that mean we're prohibited from doing any downzoning?
It means we would have to ensure
areas.
that we would have adequate housing need met. So if we downzone in one area, we would need to still demonstrate that we can meet the housing need, if not there, elsewhere.
So any decision that we take up at any future time, we're going to have to specifically, obviously it has to be in accordance with our housing element.
Correct.
So we're going to have to, if you downzone here, you have to upzone somewhere else? Is that the essential?
Well, you need to show that you have adequate zoning to meet the regional housing needs. So for instance, if we can't demonstrate that we meet it in the R1250 zone, perhaps we already meet it in a mixed use zone elsewhere. But we would need to address that and demonstrate that at any time that the zoning would be changed, if it would be changed.
All right, thanks. So, and the answer is no, it does not necessarily mean you would have to upzone another area, but we would have to demonstrate that we satisfy that. Okay,
Exactly.
Mr. City Manager.
Mr. Mayor, I was going to point out to Mr. Najarian on your question, you recall back when we rezoned open space the city had acquired, we had to hold up the final action for a period of time while we ran that action through HCD, and they had a number of questions they came back to us with relative to the impact of that on our ability to provide enough properties zoned appropriately where our arena numbers could be met. It also seemed to me in reading the staff report, there's one paragraph in particular that kind of gets to the heart of how this is treated. Some people view this as a hard and fast number. The paragraph in the staff report indicates the RENA is not a mandate to construct 3,131 housing units. It is not a mandate. According to SCAG publication titled Housing Southern Californians, June 1999, the targets are intended to assure that adequate sites and zoning exist to address anticipated housing demand during the planning period, and that market forces are not inhibited in addressing the housing needs of all economic segments of a community. But of course, as we know, the economy will determine in large part how much housing actually gets built.
All right. Mr. Weaver? Ms. Parazian?
Yeah.
Mr. Quintero? Mr. Najarian? You safe in?
Have any comments? I can introduce ordinance.
Well, let me see. I mean, do you have any other questions or comments?
And no
Mr.
other
Minson.
comments.
All right. Then Mr. Yusefian.
Yes, at this time, I'd like to move 1A.
Let's close the public hearing. Thank you.
Move 1A.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. If there's no further discussion, Mr. Kasakian.
Council members Najarian,
Yes.
Quintero,
Yes.
Weaver,
Aye.
Yusefian,
Aye.
Mayor Draymond. Mayor Draymond?
Yes, I'm sorry.
Move 1B.
Second.
All right. This is also a council resolution, correct? Okay. Is there any further discussion on that item? No. Mr. Kasakian, please.
Council members Najarian,
Yes.
Quintero,
Yes.
Weaver,
Aye.
Yusefian,
Aye.
Mayor Draymond.
Yes. All right, let's hear the item at 2A, 2 and 2A.
2 is Director of Planning and Community Development and Housing regarding multifamily parking enforcement and options regarding assignment of parking spaces. At 2A is a council motion accepting report and providing direction to staff.
All right, thank you, Mr. Kasakian. Mr. Hagani.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. This item was, this report was prepared at the direction of the City Council based on the observations that community members have made and the requests that they have made of you. So the staff report has 2 pieces. The first piece is what actually is written in the zoning code, and then the second piece is how that is implemented from the standpoint of code enforcement by neighborhood services. So Kristen Asp is going to talk about the zoning code language, and Sam Engel is going to talk about the practical issues that they confront in enforcing the code. And then after that, if the council and the housing authority have any directions to staff, we will be happy to follow. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Weaver.
So I want to make it clear, after we've given direction here, if we do, then you're going out to the public.
Yes.
So this is just to get direction what we want you to take to the public.
Yes. At this point, we're just going to give you a picture of what's in place, and if you'd like to make any changes, then we will follow.
All right, very good. Ms. Asp, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Good.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of council and the agency. As Hassan said, as this item relates to parking, over the years, the council has received complaints about the availability or accessibility of parking spaces in both residential buildings and commercial developments. And most recently, during the condominium conversion policy discussion, that some landlords are charging for use of parking spaces. It was based on that discussion that staff was asked to look at the existing code language as it relates to assignment of parking spaces to residents and tenants, and outline some options that may address the problems. And as Hassan said, I'm just going to briefly summarize the zoning code regulations for both residential and commercial. Currently, the zoning code regulates residential parking in 2 ways. The first being the standard for the number of parking spaces required at the time of construction, and the second relates to the use of required parking spaces. Specifically, that parking for residential uses shall be maintained for exclusive use of occupants and their guests, is what the code states today. It does not prevent or prohibit an owner from charging extra rent for parking spaces or require that an owner even offer spaces to the tenants. The zoning code regulates commercial parking similar to residential, again, that at the time of construction, the number of parking spaces required, at the time of construction. And also, like residential, there's no requirement for the assignment of those parking spaces. But unlike residential, commercial spaces are not limited to the exclusive use of only those tenants, employees, and customers, and this was designed to build in and allow flexibility in the code to use shared parking for the purposes, for that purpose, and are reviewed through the parking use permit and the parking reduction permit process. I'm going to have Sam just come up and speak from an enforcement perspective, as well as go over the pros and cons of each of the options, and then wait for your direction and any questions from there. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Engel.
Mayor Draymond, members of the City Council, members of the Housing Authority, probably you on council and us in Neighborhood Services realize that parking in one form or another always ranks at the top of people's concerns, and it's probably the one thing that we hear every time we are out with the public. In terms of private property, enforcement of any of the parking regulations falls to Neighborhood Services, and we tend to look at this as a quality of life problem as much as an enforcement issue when it comes to our neighborhoods. The report lists a number of things that we found in terms of the problems, and Mayor Draymond, keeping with your direction, I'm not going to go into those because they've been covered in the report unless you want me to.
Well,
but
that's all right. I'm long-winded enough on my own, Sam. I'll probably get into it later.
Okay. A couple of things that are just kind of observations, which is what Kristen asked me to cover with you, is while you would think it would be common sense to rent a unit and assign a parking space at the time that the rental is made, or to maintain some sort of parking space assignment plan, that practice has been found by our code enforcement officers is not anywhere near as common as you might think. It tends to be a lot more pragmatic and what can be worked to the best advantage of the property owner and the tenant at the time of the rental. It is nowhere near as systematic. The other thing that we found in terms of dealing with parking on the multifamily buildings is the decisions that were made in the past are now affecting how you as a city council are having to address parking today, and that we as the enforcement staff for the city are having to respond to it. The current language, which talks about exclusive use, is relatively new. For those of you who are on council for a while know that for years we required developers to build the parking, but there was no requirement there to tie it, that they would actually provide it. The requirement's relatively new, and we are now easing into it as we enforce this, as saying that the parking on residential property has to be provided for those tenants and their guests. It's not specific, and some of the solutions that were put in front of you are some of the things that we think from an enforcement perspective may alleviate some of the complaints you've heard and certainly make enforcement for our enforcement staff a little bit easier. The second part of decisions that were made in the past is that years ago parking wasn't anywhere near the premium that it is now. And there were cases, and numerous cases with multifamily units where required parking has been approved to have been converted into non-parking uses. In some cases into even additional units, which exponentially increases the parking problems on those units. Not only do you lose the parking spaces that were there, but you now no longer have parking for the unit that was created in the space where the other parking is. That's a tremendous issue out there, one that we're kind of stuck with in those cases where it was approved. Conversely, on the flip side of that in explaining this is that there's a number of units as we get out there that were added illegally, and in fact we actually go out and compel those units to be removed where units have been added in the place of real parking. The difference is when I described you that which was approved, which we're kind of stuck with, that which wasn't approved, and we enforced to get them removed from the facility. We've gotten some direction from the city attorney that the provision that states that parking must be maintained for the exclusive use of the residents would most likely be interpreted by the court to mean that the owner is prohibited from renting those out to non-residents or for other uses altogether, i.e. storage. That's the city attorney's opinion. From a staff perspective, one of the options that we're asking for to make it clearer in explaining this to people is to explicitly prohibit anything other than use for parking. And anything that we can do from having a court have to interpret our code where we can be explicit would be helpful for us. Some of the things that are happening at this point, as have been explained in the staff report, is that property owners are renting the parking spaces separately from the unit. That's not illegal. We don't really enforce any of that. The other thing is that parking spaces could be maintained in a theoretical sense empty if there were no takers. None of the renters chose to rent a parking space additionally. We've never initiated a code enforcement action for parking sitting empty. Conceivably, I suppose that we could do that. One of the issues that's out there, and because we have not gone out to the community, I think there's a lot of answers that are out there that we haven't heard yet. But one of the issues that seems to be out there is how to deal with those parking spaces being assigned equitably to those tenants that are out there, especially in buildings that were built years ago where the parking supply doesn't match the parking demand at the facility. Hopefully if the council sees fit to move forward with this and we go out, I think that there are some ideas out there with how to do this and actually address this, maybe providing us with some direction to do this. But in particular, it's going to be helpful with those buildings where there are fewer spaces than there are units. Commercial presents its own set of problems for us, and I want to stress what we tend to hear with commercial tends to be the neighborhood quality issues. And it's a whole different dynamic, and I have to stress that, than it is with the residential parking, because some of the incentives that we put in to encourage people to use transit require that they pay for parking at our commercial developments. What it means is that if people choose not to pay for parking, they choose not to use transit, what they're doing is they're parking in our residential neighborhoods where it's free and then walking to work. And you can go to any number of neighborhoods around our downtown and see that morning influx in the morning and see the afternoon thing in going the opposite direction. I don't know how to address this because it's a whole different dynamic than just providing parking, because it ties into ride sharing and all those other things. But the reason I stressed at the beginning of what my part of the report is in terms of enforcement is it's more of a neighborhood quality issue than it is an enforcement issue. The parking is there in those cases, but it's not necessarily being provided for the occupants of those businesses or buildings. Finally, from an enforcement perspective, this is one that has been around for a long time. We in Neighborhood Services and Community Development Housing are particularly pleased that the issue is being raised in a public setting, and appreciate the opportunity, if the council chooses to go forward with this, to get some community input to kind of address this. And I'm available to answer any questions if you need it. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Engel. Let me start on my left this time, just to see whether or not there is any question or input before we go to our speaker. No. Weaver, anything? Quintero? Before we go to the public?
Yeah, well, in terms of input, I would say, yeah, this is something that we need to take a look at. So I'll reserve my comments for after the speaker.
Okay. Our speaker is Herbert Milano.
Mayor Draymond, members of the City Council, City staff, my name is Herbert Milano. I'd like to start by thanking you for bringing this this subject to the agenda, and for bringing a problem that has been getting significantly worse as the years go by. From the presentation of Mr. Engel, I can tell you that it looks like he's got a pretty good handle in an understanding of what the problems are in these neighborhoods, especially the multifamily neighborhoods. And I commend housing for the level of expertise and knowledge that generally this department has. I believe that many of the issues that are happening in these areas are sometimes a little bit away from his level area of control. He brings up an issue of parking sometimes being sold or rented out to other entities. I tend to find that, specifically if I take this neighborhood where we happen to be, that many owners of single-family homes are renting out their garages, and now they have some other uses other than the use of parking. And I hope that a study is made with regard to how much parking availability would be there if there were some type of regulation with regard to encouraging owners or mandating that garages be used for automobiles. I think they will have a significant impact on the overall availability of guest parking. My building, like many buildings that were built in the 1980s, has 2 units with at least a couple of parking spots short. But when they were built, the variance made sense because there was plenty of on-street parking. Well, that is no longer the case, and it's becoming incredibly frustrating for tenants or their guests to park sometimes, 2 or 3 blocks away in order to be able to visit. That's I would love to see this issue being brought up to TPC, to the Transportation and Parking Commission, for an adequate forum on a continual basis, so that the public be invited to partake of this process in a venue that was set up for it. Because I believe that there are many answers and potential answers to resolve the problem, and I think that you have to look at many other things other than just simply a few issues having to do with insufficient parking at certain buildings. I think that the number of the roads should be studied, the number of on-street parking per area should be studied, and there are many other ideas that I'd like to bring forward as potential answers to solve the parking situation in areas where there's multifamily housing and single-family homes combined. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Malone. All right. I'll start on my left again. Ms. Parazian, any comment? Mr. Weaver.
I don't know. I think the public outreach is going to be a big component because you're going to hear a lot of different opinions. I think most of us live in single-family residences, and we don't get the proper perspective of the person who has to try to park on the street and walk 2 or 3 blocks. I know when my wife and I got married in '68, we rented an apartment on Jackson, new building, and we were given 1 parking spot with our rental unit and the option to rent a second one. And since we were just about the first tenants in, we were able to get that second one. Personally, unless I hear other arguments, which I probably will, I think the parking spaces in an apartment complex are for the tenants, not to be rented out for storage or whatever else. I think there's going to be vacant spaces sitting there. I don't believe that'll happen. Just about every family now has 2 cars in it. Some have 3 or 4, depending on kids. If anything, there's going to be an overcrowding, and that, if anybody in this world of ours knows how you can handle additional parking on our limited parking streets, I don't know how you're going to do it. But philosophically, as I said, I believe tenant parking should be for the tenants only, not for storage, not for rental to other people coming in from other places. So, same thing in commercial. So I'd like to hear what the public thinks. I think we ought to give broad perspective for the staff to go out and throw all these options out and see what they tell us.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Quintero.
I also believe we need to go out and see what the situation is like out there. And I did live in rented a condo while I worked on my home in a beautiful neighborhood, Stocker, off of Central and Columbus. And it was very interesting the time that I spent there, because there was absolutely not adequate parking. Yet in the building I rented, there were a couple of units, one of which was a full outfitted garage, double garage, with television, indoor, outdoor carpeting. It was quite a, and they spent a lot of time in there. Opened it up during the day, and another person had a shop, little sort of woodworking shop there and there. Now, these are private owners of these condominiums, townhouse condominiums, so, but they were absolutely parking on the street. But it is going to be an issue that's going to bring up a lot of opinions, I agree. And one of the things that I think we have to be flexible about is look at all of the seniors that sort of tend to live in certain apartment units that don't have any cars at all. So we have to, hopefully come up with some flexible rules. But overall, I am not one that feels that it's the right of the property owner of an apartment building to then go ahead and rent those parking spaces out to people for storage. I don't think that is in the best interest of the tenants or the best interest of the city, and ultimately not in the best interest of the property owner, because rents will absolutely dive if people can't park, if guests can't park. So anyway, I think then the other issue, the commercial parking situation, quite frankly, I think the multifamily situation is sort of long enough, or rather large enough, that alone is going to take an incredible amount of time. I mean, it's certainly combined in some neighborhoods or stretches. I'm familiar with Glen Oaks Boulevard and all of the commercial parking that takes place in the single-family residential neighborhoods along there. We've got issues off of Brand with commercial parking in the multifamily neighborhoods, and you can just go down streets in Glendale and you quickly understand that those businesses are impacting the residential neighborhoods. But I just wonder whether we do it all at one time or we sort of break it off into two different studies or two different outreaches. Prepared to support either one. I just wanted to bring it all up. But overall, I do believe we need to explore these issues.
All right, thank you. Mr. Najarian.
Thank you. I agree with some of the other comments made. I think that parking that's turned into storage should be considered a code violation and turned back to parking spaces.
That is a code violation.
We need to enforce.
And we do.
We need to.
As reported.
The other issue is the Brand Boulevard commercial buildings. It's a paradox that we made them invest so much in subterranean parking and their parking structures for their employees, but due to their pricing of monthly rates, the employees choose not to park in the structures, and they park in our neighborhoods. I mean, you look at Maryland, you look at Louise running the length of Brand. It is packed bumper to bumper, and the vast majority of those cars belong to people that work in those high-rise buildings, and those high-rise buildings have floors and floors of empty parking. As we know, we've done the surveys for other issues. So we need to, I think, reach out to those building management companies and the owners and do whatever we can to encourage them to get their employees off the streets, much as we did on Brand Boulevard, encouraging the employees to get off the diagonal parking. Whether that means a different pricing schedule, whether that means the draconian measures of permit parking or whatever, we need to get those vehicles in the spaces that are much more convenient, much safer, adjacent to their places of work, that we've forced those building owners to spend millions. Per space is what? $30,000, $40,000 a space now that they've invested. We made them invest, but they're sitting empty. And the valuable spaces in our residential neighborhoods are taken up by the employees. So I think that's one of the targets that we should have to try and solve that problem.
All right, Mr. Yusefian.
I think I'm not going to belabor the point and repeat everything. I agree with Mr. Najarian and Mr. Quintero. I've seen many streets that have new condominiums, maybe built in the 90s, late 80s, large projects, apartments, condos, big, huge subterranean. At night you drive by, lights are on, Nobody's inside those parking structures. The street's almost unpassable. Go down Winchester, south of Glen Oaks. That's all you see. And I think I'd like to send this to the TPC with staff to give it a good airing and come back to us with some recommendations. I think we have all these requirements, but then again, we allow them to get around the system somehow. So let's tighten it up and say, listen, these are the requirements. You're required to have so many parking spaces per unit. That unit goes with those parking spaces. I don't care where you put it, how you do it, but it needs to be there. And so I'm not going to micromanage this at this point. I can if you want me to, but I don't want to do that.
So can we have a consensus from those on the dais as to whether they would like Mr. Yusefian to micromanage?
I want to send it to TPC. I think they have the expertise, and also it gives a little bit more airing.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Yusefian. Mr. Mincy.
Thank you, Mr. Yusefian.
You're welcome.
I didn't realize that, let's say it's a single home, you have a two-car garage, and if you use one half of it for storage, that's against the code? Did I hear you right?
Multi-family.
No, it wasn't the example I was using. I was using an example of if Mr. Mincy, if a multifamily building landlord had a building and he instead of giving those spaces to the tenants, he or she leased those spaces out for storage.
Because if there's ever a survey, I bet that's very common. I know it was when I owned a home. As an apartment owner and as a senior, there's about 80% seniors in my apartment complex. But I think all the parking spaces always seem to be full. Now, there's some that do work that have two cars, even seniors that have two cars, but you never see empty spaces there. Everything is assigned. But just as far as my experience with that, and but I do know this walking 2 or 3 blocks away is just a hassle. I remember when I used to spend time in Manhattan, these poor people trying to find a parking space within blocks of their places. That's why most people don't drive there. It's just almost impossible. Now, our situation isn't that bad, but I can sure relate to it.
Thank you, Mr. Mincy. I do want to belabor a couple of things. So, Mr. Yusefian giveth, and I taketh away in this case.
All yours.
This has been an issue to me since about 1995, since I've been coming to the city about this issue, and going to the various commissions and before council and so on and so forth. And my issue with this started with commercial. So my answer to Mr. Quintero's sort of open-ended comment is I want to see us look at both. So I want to tell that story. Some of you have heard me tell it, but I want to tell it again because it demonstrates not only how we have a problem, but it also demonstrates how various departments are involved, and because there isn't coordination, a whole neighborhood becomes impacted. I had a small business at the time on Broadview Drive in Glendale in the 1900 block. There was no residential housing on that block of Broadview. And on the south side of the street where my small business was located, there were a number of commercial units, rental units. On the north side of the street, virtually that whole block was taken up with one business. It was a contractor that remodeled existing Pizza Hut units and other fast food chains. The issue that unfolded was that this fellow wanted to take up some of his parking spaces on his private lot to put up a cellular antenna and the facility that went with it, the panel boxes and all that went with it. And so it meant he was going to lose 2 parking spaces. Of course, the problem is that he wasn't using his parking lot to begin with. He was parking all of his commercial vehicles on the street. So none of the retail businesses ever had parking. And, of course, the first thing we did was to go to TPC and say, hey, how about some limited parking here? While that was finding its way through for months and months and months, in the meantime, we still have this other issue that he's going to lose 2 more spaces. What came to light was, oh, guess what? This same developer had illegally built an extension to his business out onto his parking lot, therefore losing about 13 spaces. Now, these were spaces that the city had required him to have in the first place in order to operate his business. Big surprise. That's why he's parking all of his trucks out on the street or in the local municipal lots. And then it turned out that, of course, we went through a process then that we're dealing with right now. He then retroactively went through a design process, a planning process that says, let's pretend that what I built isn't really there. Here's my design. Can I get this approved? Guess what the city did? Approved it. You betcha. And all the howling and screaming that I did and other businesses did and the merchants associations did just fell on deaf ears. He was a well-established contractor. The other thing that I left out was, in this building where he was required to have this parking that he built an illegal structure out of onto, covering up the parking that he was allowed to keep eventually, was the fact that he had subletted the rest of his building to a bunch of other contractors, a plasterer, an electrician, a paver, and they all have trucks, and they are all required to have parking for their individual units, which are now inside this previously illegal structure, but is now a legal structure. Anyway, the bottom line is, this is how various city departments and commissions, all working separately, not in concert, ended up approving a mess for a community, which didn't end up getting actually settled until 2006, finally. So 11 years later, when that developer finally pulled up stakes and moved away, it was finally resolved with some limited parking on the street. And this is the kind of craziness that's been going on now. Also, so yeah, I want to see the commercial angle of this looked at as well. These cars from customers, from the businesses, are being forced south of us down into the residential neighborhoods all day long, all night long. In terms of the residential areas, just to clarify, Mr. Garcia, you said in answer to Mr. Mincy, if they choose to rent out or lease out their, in a multifamily, their garage spaces, their parking spaces for storage, what about if they don't lease it out, but they just choose to use it for that?
Same thing.
Right. So it's not just whether they lease it, it's whether they don't use it for, they're using it for something other than for parking for their tenants. Because we know that to some degree in this city, we see multifamily units where a landlord will say, Mr. Milano, you have your family, you're interested in our 2-bedroom, 1-bath apartment of umpty years old, and we can rent it to you for $13.50 a month, or if you want to pay $16.50, you can have the parking space. And if you're on a tight budget or a young family starting out, you're trying to get your wheels under you, you say, you know what, we'll rent it for $13.50 and we'll take our chances and park out on the street. Mr. Weaver, you mentioned about that most of us live in single-family homes. Well, I don't.
I know.
No, I wasn't criticizing you. I just want to make the point. I don't. I have lived in single-family home in this city. I've been a tenant. I've been a condominium owner, as I am now. I've lived in the county portion and the city portion. And I've also been an owner of rental housing as well. So I sort of have an experience across the board with that stuff. I know what my days were like when I was working in a different industry. And I would have a 5 o'clock call to go to the studio, and I'd be there, and I'd get home about 6 o'clock, 6:30 at night, And I spent easily a half hour circling and circling and circling and circling and circling so I could find a parking space so I could go home. It is absolutely a quality of life issue that is just key to thousands and thousands of people who own apartment houses in this city. My colleagues don't need to make the point because but I think it needs to be said out loud. Just in 91205 zip code, over 10,000 apartment units alone in that one zip code. So I don't think we know how systemic these individual issues are. I think what we know is what complaints have come forward. I think we'll know how systemic it is once we do some public outreach. Then there's the aspect of illegal units that are out there. As Mr. Quintero's talking about, his neighbors over on, what was it, on Columbus or Stocker, that had converted apartments to rental units.
No, I'm sorry.
Oh, they were just using it as a timeshare. Pardon me.
No. They were the family itself.
Oh, was using it. Okay.
It's just that they weren't parking their cars in their double garages.
I see. Well, in parts of our city, Mr. Quintero, as you may well know, we have single-family property owners that are renting out converted this and converted that, converted garages, buildings and structures that were put in illegally or allowed to stay illegally because they haven't come to anybody's attention. But those folks are parking somewhere, and they're parking on the street. And as it goes without saying that this is not just a quality of life issue in terms of ease of getting in and out when it comes to public safety on some of the smaller streets where it's so loaded up with parking and we can't even get an emergency vehicle there. To watch a neighbor's house burn down or not to be able, I'm not saying that has happened, but the potential is there, and or to have an emergency vehicle not be able to quickly and efficiently get to somebody on a narrow street with a paramedic, that's more than a quality of life issue. That's that's more than just a bummer. That's really a significant tragedy. So we need to do some major outreach on this. Some of the cons that are listed here to me are non-issues, such as the one that says, in a case where a tenant does not have as many cars as spaces provided, a parking space could remain vacant while guests or other residents with additional cars, well, that exists now. So to me, that's not a con to implementing, that's not a reason not to implement an option like tying parking spaces to units in residential developments. I do see a distinction between single-family homes and multifamily buildings because, as in the case of Mr. Quintero is pointing out, these are people that own the property themselves and are owner-users, as opposed to, say, if Mr. Yusefian owns an apartment building and he has tenants who they themselves are not the owner of the property. So anyway, I really want to see all this looked at to the extent that we're going to see large numbers of vacant spaces on the streets. No, I don't think that's going to happen either. But let me tell you, to the people that are out there, you see it every work night in this city. People circling around and around and around trying to find, as Mr. Mincy says, a parking space somewhere near their house. It's some kind of relief to them. And to the extent that we can tighten this up, we need to do it. We absolutely need to do it. I'm very anxious to hear the results of the public outreach. Yes, Mr. Hagani.
Once you're ready, I can give you an idea of how we could probably approach that.
Absolutely. I think my colleagues are more than ready. They've heard enough from me. Mr. Quintero.
Yeah. If we are going to pursue the commercial districts, quite often I've found, since I've been serving on the council, a lot of issues have to do with a new business. There's sort of an established equilibrium in a particular neighborhood, single family or multifamily, but primarily single family that backs up to a commercial zone. If a new business goes in, quite often that equilibrium is thrown out the door. And so somehow we have to try to find some answer because, well, the ultimate answer is for those single family property owners to do a parking, petition and
Preferential
preferential parking, and that's it. Ultimately, that seems to be where it goes. But we always have months and sometimes years of strife before that takes place. So I just wanted to point that out. It's happened on South Central Avenue. It's happened on Glen Oaks, just numerous times.
Mayor,
Mr. Weaver.
one thing, something I've mentioned many times in the past, if we don't start looking at downzoning some of those areas that are zoned for multifamily now, that are single family, knowing full well that a developer's going to come in and build condos there. If you don't change the zoning down to single family, you're ultimately going to have even more cars parked on those streets. We're not going to improve it at all, no matter what we do, other than downzoning it so you can't get 5, 10 families with 2 or 3 cars living on a street where it was a single family with 1 or 2 cars. So I mentioned in the past, I hope staff looks at that someday.
Mr. Hagani, beyond the rhetoric that we're all up here tossing your way, and I'll please feel free to respond to that in a moment. But I just wanted to add something I neglected. My particular ramble was I do agree that we need to not only find a way to work with some of the commercial property owners and management companies that have basically empty garages. We need to incentivize it in a way so that, in other words, it's more than just talking to them. We need to find a way to get the commercial tenants into the commercial garages and off the street. So, yes, sir.
Let me add one more, because this really happened. It was with Nestle's. People refusing to pay, the workers refusing to pay their price for parking. They're parking on the surface streets. Because we had a case 1 block north of Glen Oaks on Brand, Fairmount, whatever it is. The retail people there, nobody could park because the workers from Nestle's were parking there for free. Now, we got a time limit within 2 hours, and that killed that idea. But you have all these downtown garages that are basically empty at night, and there's no way we can make them open them up for people that are downtown or for neighboring residential. They just say no, and that's it.
Yeah, but I think what Mr. Najarian was referring to is
during the day.
Is during the day.
Oh, yeah.
And you have people at work who are working folks and are parking in the residential
Because they don't
neighborhoods.
want to pay.
Right. And that's why I'm saying it's more than just talking to them about it. We have to find a way to...
I've been told we can't, so let's find out.
Well, maybe we can. Mr. City Manager, yes.
Well, on the Nestle situation, going a little deeper, the underlying cause of their charge was an AQMD regulation, I think Rule 15, that allowed a number of alternatives to be taken by these large employers to get their employees to rideshare. One of them, which I think was one of the easier alternatives, was to begin charging for the parking, and frankly then making usually a stipend available to an employee in their check so that if they didn't use the parking, presumably ride sharing to come in, they would then benefit by it. Well, what happened was the employees then just parked off on our streets. They could get the incentivization. Nestle's would meet their Rule 20 requirements, and we were left with a problem on the city streets because
didn't know that
employees were kind of circumventing it. Yeah, and we may find that with other large employers. So sometimes you look below the surface and you see what's causing some of these things to occur.
I hadn't heard the end result.
Yeah,
That makes sense.
But that rule was
I don't know. It might have been. This has
My
been quite a
question
while
is
ago.
not for Hassan, maybe it's for city attorney. I just remember the experience that I have with my previous apartment. The tenants that they don't have cars, they are renting out their parkings to the other neighbors. Is that legal or illegal?
Take a look. I mean, if they're using it for tenants of other buildings, it's probably of that building itself. Again, it's being maintained for the exclusive use of that particular building. It wouldn't be illegal per se.
So they can make money on their own parking spots?
Yeah, I think what happens, that was one of the things that was going through my, I think seniors quickly figure out that there's other families living that may need the space, so they do a private deal with...
Especially if they have 2 spaces.
Mr. Hagani, as they sometimes say, bring us home.
Okay, in the interest of making an action plan that we can actually follow and bring some results to you. I wanted to go back to a couple of directions you've given us in the past and propose perhaps what we can do using the same process that we have already started elsewhere to address this issue as well. First of all, when you adopted the downtown mobility plan, you addressed all of these issues, specifically focusing in the downtown area and the surrounding residential neighborhoods, and you addressed residential, commercial, and mixed-use buildings and several different alternatives to address the regulations, pricing, disincentives and incentives to address some of these issues. And you gave us the direction to work with transportation staff to implement some of the implementation strategies one by one. We haven't gotten to the parking implementation step yet. The first step was the meters on brand, and the second step was the transportation demand management ordinance, which is what we're working on right now. This is the next step of the downtown mobility plan that will be implemented in conjunction with the other departments, with TPC, and we'll be giving you a report back. So that's the first thing. The other thing that we're doing is, as we are working on our neighborhood or community plans, starting with the North Glendale community plan, one of the ideas that we're examining, because we know the downtown mobility plan does not necessarily apply to everywhere in Glendale. Each place has its own set of characteristics that need to be addressed. But some of the broad policies that you discussed in detail with Nelson Nygaard and with staff are applicable perhaps. So one of the things we're doing, including all of the discussion on parking, we're going to present those in each neighborhood that we meet with to see if the same parking strategies that you have directed us to look at for downtown might be applicable. Again, they address many of the issues that you have raised today. The one issue that the downtown mobility plan does not necessarily address is the code language and how to take the code enforcement one step beyond what currently our code does, which goes into the scenario that Ms. Parazian raised and other scenarios that you've raised. We can deal with that at the zoning code level, perhaps holistically, and bring back to your report. But the neighborhood-specific ideas, if you're okay with that, we can discuss the same strategies with the neighborhoods and give you a report back to see what the community members are receptive to, because we're having targeted meetings with business owners, targeted meetings with commercial property owners, targeted meetings with residential owners and residential neighborhoods, and we're going to identify the competing interests, which parking also plays a role at. If you're okay with that approach, we can then capitalize on the same processes instead of starting a brand new discussion citywide on parking alone.
I have a question for you about that. By combining it into another process, I mean, this is a pretty impacted city, parking-wise. How long does that stand to delay potential movement from the council by combining it with this other discussion? I know that it is a separate discussion to go out there now. However, sometimes a separate discussion also conveys not only to the public but perhaps to staff as well that there is a particular emphasis being placed on this and that there is a priority.
So we do two different processes. One is what we can do in the zoning code right away, which we can do as part of our ongoing zoning process, that we can address holistically what can be changed in the zoning code to address some of it. But the neighborhood specific, so that one we could do right away because we are having a zoning code advisory group that we work with. We can discuss that with them, add some more zoning language, and come back to you fairly quickly. But the other one, which is neighborhood specific strategies, would take a while. It would be neighborhood by neighborhood, because we have this kind of outreach. Whether we discuss one item or whether we could discuss 5 items with the neighborhood takes the same level of outreach. And we are already focusing all of our resources in doing an outreach in one part of the city, and we could use that. Or else we'll have to rethink the priorities and see how much of our staff time we could dedicate to this issue alone to discuss citywide and then bring it back.
Mr. City Manager.
Well, as maybe an alternative to that, although that may produce a little better quality in the long term, there may be a way, as it relates to multifamily, to get some pretty immediate feedback, and that would be to just have a meeting with those major firms that probably represent the management of the bulk of the apartment and rental units, residential in Glendale, and actually convey But the council is very concerned about this. In fact, one of the options is to have an ordinance that would essentially require that a unit be connected to a parking space if indeed they exist, and just get a sense of what the reaction is. I mean, if they say, you know, who cares, we don't see this as a broad problem, then conceivably you could possibly move forward more quickly. If you feel there's going to be a gigantic, you know, wave of resistance and opposition, then you may want to take more time and get a better sense of it. But there's a handful of property management firms I think could very quickly give you a sense. I'm told some of them actually manage the rental of garages and parking spaces in this town as well, and can give you a pretty quick sense of just how broad spread this problem is. That's what I've been told. I don't know that for a fact, but that's what I've been told.
And you're speaking of both residential.
No, I'm just talking multifamily residential for now, not the commercial part.
All right. Can I make a suggestion that we, well, just one second. As one individual, I'm not so keen on combining them this time. I see this as being a very protracted process, which I'm not adverse to at all when it comes to looking at other zoning issues throughout the city. That does take time, and that does require a lot of public outreach. But I'm not so anxious to see the kind of impacted parking issues we have in the city languishing, because I think we have the ability to begin to take care of some of this more quickly. So Mr. Yusefian suggested at one point that some of this be placed with the public hearings and vetting go on with the TPC. Anybody know whether the TPC is terribly busy with a heavy schedule right now? I'm sort of half joking.
Oh, okay.
So I'm suggesting maybe the city's role should be to let the public know in a large promotional way that the council is looking at this and is soliciting the input and working with the TPC to agendize this in a way that is understandable. And let's start getting it into some public hearings there so that some recommendations can be brought back. I mean, that's one way. That doesn't tie up your staff, Hassan, while you're already working on other zoning issues. And I don't say that to preclude other things we might do, such as talking to the management companies. We can do that in tandem, or ask them to
or ask them to appear.
Yeah, ask them to appear. But let's use that forum. That's another way. Mr. Yusefian.
And I agree with that. I understand what Hassan is trying to do. He's going down systematically to deal with this. But, you know, this has been a problem in this city for a long time. I lived in here for 32 years. I was a manager of a 52-unit apartment building, so I have some understanding of what goes on in there. But when I used to manage an apartment building, had not gotten to the point that it has gotten today. So I think there's a certain amount of urgency in my mind on this particular issue. We have talked about it, I think, since 2004 or something like that.
I've been here since 1995 talking about it.
So, I mean, no, the council has talked about it, but every time something else comes ahead, and so we kind of put that aside and move on something more urgent. I think this is something urgent enough that we just need to kind of deal with it this way. It's not very convoluted. It's, you know, we can deal with it in multifamily. I think the issue on commercial may get a little bit trickier over there. But nevertheless, I think part of the problem is the Regulation 15 that Mr. Starbird was talking about. But that regulation was lifted after Arnold came in, by the way. That was taken off. And you could check on that, but I'm pretty sure that was taken off. And then on top of that, we force them, we incentivize that they have to pay them. That's why they don't park in those places. So we may have to change that. It kind of goes contrary to what our mobility study says. But we have to kind of look at that and say, what's more important? Maybe we do it differently. Because mobility study also took into place mass transit and so on and so forth. But when that is not available, maybe in the meantime, we need to put people in the parking spaces instead of having all those vacant parking spaces that are sitting there. And then the neighborhood is completely impacted. And the small businesses who are in that neighborhood are also impacted. So I think, when is the next TPC meeting?
They meet once a month. They're meeting actually this week. We had a joint Planning Commission TPC meeting, which we canceled because some of the mobility plan issues that we were not prepared to take before them. And next month, there's a meeting.
I will tell you, I know all the TPC members, and I know all the Planning Commission members, and their mindset to me has always been, anytime this council wants to put something in front of us, even on emergency basis, we're always willing and able to meet. So don't wait until the next regular meeting. If you're able to put this in front of them within 3 weeks or 2 weeks, call them. I've never seen people in those two commissions that are so willing to help.
My concern is, I agree, but my concern is, it's not a matter of this moving too quickly to the TPC because they're not available. It's that I want to make sure the city does a full court press on notification of all of the appropriate potential stakeholders so that they know to attend, to know that we want their input. So that's the reason why I want enough time.
Understood. And if am I understanding the direction correctly that you would
I don't know.
That you would like this to be addressed in the zoning code? Because I must say, I hate to do this, but I must say that although the TPC is available, our zoning code staff who are working on the zoning code are already charged with a few other projects. And then it's the same staff who will have to work with the TPC and the Planning Commission. We will address this and we'll work with the city manager on how to prioritize it and schedule it according to council direction.
Thank you. Any other input?
Oh, do you need a motion to that effect?
I don't think we do. It was for just direction to staff, wasn't it?
There was a motion to give direction, but you've given it.
We're okay.
Good.
Okay.
Move we
Thank you,
adjourn for
Mr.
the city
Hagani.
council.
Second.
Council is adjourned.
Move we adjourn for the housing.
Second.
We're adjourned.